teachers, students, alumni, we the people judges, and the generally curious to the fourth season and the 121st episode of the Constitution in American Life with these three good-looking scholars and a host who reminds his grandchildren of Jabba the Hutt. Since we were last together in the springtime, so much has happened. The not-so-Supreme Court of the United States has implemented a judicial counter-revolution that has erased much of the New Deal, Warren and Burger courts in regards to rights, separation of powers, federalism, and representation, to the point that I don't recognize our constitutional arrangement any longer. Add to that a political system that has experienced a roller coaster ride that is no doubt entertaining and fun, but not quite consistent with the idea of stable constitutional democracy, some might argue. And lastly, for the first time that I can remember, no team in Major League Baseball has a winning percentage above 600, which means that the race to the postseason should be one of the most exciting and nerve-wracking. Oh my gosh, even the Cubs and the Giants are still in the postseason picture. So that tells you how wacky it is in America today. So, excuse me, in our first episode this season, we have decided to provide some introductory background information and insights that we hope will help teachers and students with the 36 episodes that are to follow this academic year. To begin with, for those who are new to the program, as well as those who have short-term memory issues, let's introduce the Friends of Publius. First, we have the elderly statesman of the program, Professor Tim Moore from the Center on the Study of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. And rumors, I hear rumors, and if I understand correctly, it may be closing its doors after 35 or 55 years. Is that
55,
true?
yeah, 55. Yeah, we're shutting down. The project will be done.
And so that leaves open a lot of questions that maybe we can address later about.
Well, I'm not going to be moving to California because the homeless. So I won't be going to California. Let's put it that way.
Well, they are cleaning them out. The governor did, issue an executive order. Now, cities like LA, I don't know about San Diego, Mike. What's San Diego's response? Because the LA mayor said no to the governor.
No, yeah, San Diego's we're on board. We're leading the way.
Oh, good. Well, San Francisco, I think, actually is leading the way. Their mayor is really excited about that. So it might be cleaned up by the time you could find a house that you can afford there, Professor Moore, here in California. The Mojave Desert has some affordable real estate. You might want to look into that there. That's right. Average temperature, 75 degrees. That's the average per year. All right, 115 and 45. That's, if you can do that, you're going to be fine there. Next is Professor Chris Kavanaugh, who currently resides and teaches in Bismarck, North Dakota. But I would venture to say that his true home could be found in Plainfield, Indiana, and that he will forever be a Hoosier. Professor Kavanaugh is a former We the People teacher coach, recognized by numerous organizations as one of America's best civic education teachers, and has been a mentor and a judge for the Center for the Civic Education. We move now to our non-boomer, the puppy of the FOPs, Dr. James Michael Williams, professor of political science at the University of San Diego. Mike specializes in comparative politics, focusing on Africa, specifically South Africa. Professor Williams also holds a JD from American University. He has been formally involved with the We the People program as a coordinator, scholar, and judge since 2006, and was a member of the first class of high school students to pilot the We the People curricular materials back in the 1980s. And I am David Richmond, your host of the Constitution of American Life. I have been involved with the We the People program since its inception in 1987-88 as a teacher coach, mentor teacher, state coordinator, and judge. Collectively, the FOPs bring over 100 years of experience with the We the People program, and I hesitate to guesstimate how many hearings we have deliberated over in our time with the program, but I feel safe to say that it is in the tens of thousands. So the first issue we would like to talk about in our intro program here for the 2024-25 academic year emanates from last year's national finals. Throughout our 3 days of evaluating students, schools, and talking with teachers and students, we were asked numerous times why we didn't address this or that issue in a hearing question. So I would like to take a moment and discuss our mission statement and our purpose. And so, gentlemen, we'll start with you, our elderly statesman, Professor Moore. What is kind of our mission, and what's our purpose here in the Constitution of American life?
Yeah, I think we've heard this the 3 years that we've been doing this, but you're right. It did seem like we heard a little bit more of it this last year than we did in previous years. And I guess from the very beginning, when David and Terry Richmond, Terry's Dave's wife, came up with this idea, the thought was, students and teachers, you have the questions. You have the 18 questions, 3 per unit. It's your job to answer those questions. We kind of always configured this project as we're going to talk about ideas that are related to the central question. Actually, and we're going to talk about ideas that might come up in the follow-up, the 6-minute phase of a hearing. So we've kind of always thought that our mission was to raise issues. Sometimes we have differences of opinion, which you'll find in your experience that's not a bad thing. So I guess our mission was always to talk about related ideas, kind of on their really addressing the follow-up phase. And I guess to visually maybe illustrate this, I'll just put this up real quick. You have in the center here is the hearing question, the bold and the 2 bullet points, and you have 4 minutes to answer those things. We've always thought of our job is to talk about, again, these secondary issues, sometimes tertiary, because sometimes sometimes we can get pretty knee deep in the weeds, but and we'll address those concepts, and each one of us has particular strengths. So you'll notice that outside the bullseye is kind of where our discussions are. Mike's emphasis is on political science and comparative analysis. My lane is historical. And Chris, who I've often said is probably the most valuable person in the whole project, Chris is just an unbelievably well-read, well-rounded person. And so Chris actually does many of these things on the outer edges there, but don't expect us to answer the question. Expect us to talk about ideas that are related to the central questions that you're addressing.
Chris or Mike, anything to add to that?
Well, I like the visual, Tim. That's good. I understand it better now. I think it's just an analogy I would use is, in our discussions that we have, I think we do try to mirror civil discourse until Dave pushes my buttons, which he's a master at doing. And that tends to get me ramped a little bit. He is a master button pusher. But I think the other thing is to use this analogy I used to use with my students when I was teaching the course is that we want to dig a well and we want to fill it full of water. So when you get asked a question in follow-up, as Tim was alluding to, you can throw that bucket down in the well and pull up some water. Because Dave does a great job of crafting our discussion around the question without necessarily answering the question. So we are really, we're not dancing around it. We're not dancing around the question, but it's just we're having a discussion with the question in the middle, as Tim's graphic just showed. But we're approaching it from all these different angles with these questions that David will come up with. He's kind of our bus driver. And so I think our job is for students and teachers that watch us, one of the things I think we're doing is we're putting some water in your well. So when you get a off the wall follow-up question or something, you can think, oh, I remember Professor Williams was talking about that when he was talking about some comparative analysis, or Tim was bringing up some historical stuff from the crazy guys in colonial Western Pennsylvania, because it was just off the chain in Western Pennsylvania, as we have learned. So I think that's kind of what I see us doing.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I had in my notes that we provide context, which Tim kind of alluded to, and we provide these connections kind of across the different ways to get at the question. And I think that's kind of what Chris was talking about. I also think we're trying to emulate how to have meaningful conversations about this, how to disagree politely, how to push each other, how to ask, how do you know that? Where is that evidence coming from? And not just dealing with generalities. So I think we're trying to model how four people who love talking about history and politics and the Constitution, four people who are very good friends, how we engage in these conversations in ways that we may not always convince each other, but we do so in a civil way, and we do so in a way that, every time we're done with a session, I've learned at least 5 or 10 different things. So I see that as kind of the purpose.
And rarely does anybody on the panel say, and I agree with my colleague.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know that any of us have changed any of our mind anybody else's minds, but
Oh, I'm with Mike. You guys, I come away enlightened every time.
Yeah.
yeah, but you never agree with me, Chris.
Well, I know I'm right. I'm still come away a little enlightened.
You could have agreed with him right there, and then it would have been like this good moment.
I agree with my colleague.
Mike said something that made me think about this. If you're new students, if you're going into this thinking that this is a debate where your task is to win an argument, I would caution against that, really, because it's not so much that you're out to persuade, you're out to articulate and make an argument without the explicit intention to convert somebody's mind. And so when both Mike and Chris were talking about, just a full orb discussion, I think it might be best to drop this approach that I have to win this argument with your colleagues. I don't know. Other thoughts on that, guys?
Well, I agree that this is not speech and debate, or this is not a debate program. However, there are, I think, certain components of it at times, depending on how a question is posed. I can say that, frequently I will present an issue to students. I may actually, within the framework of the question, I may take a position and ask the students to tell me whether I'm right or wrong there. Now, ideally, I'm going to have some members of that panel say I'm right, and some members of that panel say I'm wrong, and it's not. And again, there's not a right answer in that. What we're looking for is thoughtful, insightful, reasoned, and evidentiary kind of answers there. So I would agree with you. It's not a debate with the panel of judges. It's not a debate per se with the other members of their panel here. It is a hearing in which they are the experts in that unit of study, and even and we all know this, that experts in any field, you're going to have a range of viewpoints there, and ideally their goal is to present that range of viewpoints on that. Secondly,
But just
go ahead, Chris.
Just to dovetail in there, David, I would agree with everything you just said. It's not a debate. However, I think this is one of the beauties as students which are going to be new to this program. And one of the frustrations is you'll read through the book and you'll want to know what's the right answer. Where's the right answer? And, there aren't right answers. There are just better arguments. And I think that is the key. You're not necessarily, I mean, obviously it is a competition-based class. And so I'm competitive. I like to win. I mean, so I would agree with Tim, but there's not necessarily a right answer. You have to give a thoughtful answer supported by evidence. And so there are not right answers. They're just better arguments.
Yeah. I just want to say one more thing, just to highlight that, Dave, you're the one who is kind of leading the bus and having the follow-up, the questions that we're going to talk about kind of prepared. And I think there's a lot for students and teachers to learn just by thinking about what questions you're asking, because it's not to answer the question. It's just kind of like to get a broader context, just think critically through the issue, through the entire curriculum, not necessarily the one unit we're focused on. And I think there's something to be gained and how those discussions go because of the types of questions you prepared for us. And I think students should be practicing that within their units, of coming up with questions for their units that could kind of maybe model that.
So Tim kind of touched on this, but maybe a little bit more depth, and really kind of allows each of you to sell yourself, and that is, every band, everybody has a role in the band: bass player, lead guitar, lead singer, percussion, keyboards, who knows, or someone like possibly Professor Kavanaugh can play all the instruments in the band.
I got no rhythm,
But
man.
I
I
am
got no
curious
rhythm.
is
I got the cowbell. I got cowbell.
okay. I thought that was my role.
I got a fever.
But I am curious of how you would describe your strength. What do you bring to the Friends of Publius and to the Constitution of American Life program? You have a specialty, you have a certain strength. How do you describe yourselves? And we'll start with the youngster, Professor Williams. What do you think is your strength in this program?
Well, I get some criticism here from my friends sometimes because I don't talk enough, but I think I'm demonstrating good empathetic, good listening skills, just trying to hear all the arguments before I dive in. No, I think it's I think it's really, I teach and I study a lot of comparative politics and comparative constitutional law and dabble in the American side of things. So I like to think that I can kind of bring in what's happening outside the U.S. or what's another perspective to look at this issue that maybe students aren't thinking about. Maybe some of you aren't, you three aren't thinking about just because you're not immersed in sort of the comparative literature like I am. So whenever we're talking about a specific unit or question, I mean, Dave, as the wonderful kind of bus driver for this, he's always thinking about comparative questions to get me thinking about it. But I spent some time on that to kind of just think about how the American experience compares to others, because I think there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to teach about how, the U.S. experience with our constitutional democracy, how it compares to the rest of the world.
And I just wanted to reiterate, or not reiterate, but reinforce that my mentor, that is my collegiate mentor, the professor that had the most influence on me, was not he taught American history at the university, but he was not an American. And he said, and talking about his own country, he said, it's very different teaching that subject from the outside in rather than from the inside out. You have very, very different perspectives. And I think that's something that you bring to the table, Mike. And I think it's something important, especially in the 21st century here, that American students understand, is that, the world doesn't quite necessarily see us the way that we might see ourselves. And that's a valid perspective, to entertain as they are exploring these ideas here. Chris, how do you describe yourself?
Well, real back up to Mike, I'm going to really date myself here, and three of us will know this, and one of us will not. But when Mike speaks, it's kind of like those old E.F. Hutton commercials, right? You know what I'm talking about? When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen.
People listen.
Students and teachers, you're going to have to be an old head like us to get that. So when Mike starts bringing up what's happening around the world, it really is fascinating for me. I think I'm kind of like that utility infielder. To stay with the baseball analogy, I've got to hang out with historians like Tim and his boss and other people through the course of my career. So I know a little, I mean, I'm kind of like Jefferson, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I know a little bit of history because I teach it. But I also, because I've taught the program, I tend to know a lot of case law. And I still try to stay pretty current on what's going on in the world. I mean, I vary back and forth on what I read between. Well, I'm looking at that. I'm looking over my shoulder and I can see a crap ton of books. So I try to keep my fingers in a lot of different things in terms of current events, what the court is doing or not doing, or back to your lead in, David, about the court. Yeah, I'm sure we will be discussing that at some point. Shudder. But also the idea that my background is as a U.S. history teacher, and my master's was an emphasis on the founding period. So I was right in the wheelhouse of this program. So I'm just kind of that utility infielder. I'm never going to hit the ball out of the park, but I can get on base.
Professor Moore.
Well, I was a teacher for 30 years, but in the last 15, I've been over at a research project at UW-Madison, where we kind of specialize on the founding period, specifically the ratification. We publish materials on the ratification stories in all the 13 states. So I guess my role is to dredge up the distant past on a weekly basis as we gather. Now, I don't know whether that's a strength or a weakness. I would like to believe that's a strength to constantly dredge up the past. And I think honestly, there's an upside and a downside to that. I mean, the upside is I think it's always good to, and you'll notice that we joke a lot about presentism, taking I mean, current things and kind of either ignoring the past or making the past try to fit into what's going on right now. Sometimes that's not a clean fit. I've often said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot at points. So I think the strength is to remind students that in the past there was a lot of things that happened similarly. There's a lot of negative things that happened. So I kind of would like to configure a strength of mine as being, now hold on, guys. We've seen this movie. Let's simmer down. Let's not get all worked up. Now, the downside to that is I have been accused, and sometimes rightfully so, of kind of ignoring currently what's going on, being a little too rooted in the past. And so I think I can bring a kind of a curmudgeonly approach by drudging up all this old stuff. But I have to be reminded by my colleagues here that sometimes I do get a little too enamored with the past, and maybe ought to pick up a newspaper and read it.
Oh,
So
that's why
What's
when
a
you
newspaper?
that's why when you go to the link and tap, it's a business expense for you.
yes.
Well, and again, you're not, the positive part about this is you're not just grounded in the 18th century. You're fairly knowledgeable in the 19th century as well. And I would say knowledgeable than more than 90% of American society in the 20th century. Might be a little weak on the late 20th, early 20th first, as you just mentioned about newspapers.
Wait, we're in the 21st century? Wait, what?
Yeah, something like that. But given that one of the main areas of the curriculum is history, it's, I think, very valuable to us, and I think to students and teachers, that we have somebody who is so well grounded in the 18th century there. But you've also, I think, expressed very well the dilemma, and one that we deal with constantly on this program. In fact, there's some disagreement amongst us, as there is, I think, in general society, about how truly relevant are what the framers thought about specific issues to 21st century society. And I think Professor Moore would be one of the first to say we got to be very careful to try to put them into the 21st century, which I think is valuable. Now, it's important to understand their debates, their discussion, their viewpoints there, but I don't think we can transplant them so easily to the 21st century and say, well, and again, as politicians tend to do quite frequently, well, Jefferson would feel this, about, I don't know, abortion or something. You're kind of going, really, that would be interesting. Can you provide some evidence of that? So don't sell yourself short there. And we always are entertained by your views on 21st century issues there, Professor Moore. So like I said, we like it that you don't like presentism so much.
All right, David, what's your what do
Hey,
you bring to
clearly,
the
well,
table?
in your
Yeah,
baseball,
come on, David. What
oh,
do you
no, no,
bring to the
clearly in your
table?
baseball analogy, I'm the
We
pitcher.
we want to know what did you bring to this project after 4
I
years? Come
am,
on.
again, listening skills, follow Professor Williams' example here, listening skills. I am the pitcher. All right. I am one skill only, and then I throw things at the other three. All right. Sometimes they're set up so that they can hit it out of the park. Sometimes I throw them a curveball or a changeup. I have no other skills. I can't hit. I
No.
can't run. I can't field. All right, but I can throw and hit the spot that the catcher sets up for me, and that's what I see my role is one, to try to ask questions that are in the genre of follow-up questions that the students might have to go through, assuming that you've directly, answered the questions that have been posed to you. So that's what I see as my role. Doesn't stop me from throwing in my 2 cents of worth of knowledge here. I think I represent the average high school teacher who doesn't have, advanced degrees. I think I'm above average in my knowledge of the issues that we talk about, but I'm nowhere close to these gentlemen. And that's, like I say, I'm the bus driver to try to highlight or get them to highlight their skills there, and so that's my role as I see it, in my strength there, and it's very consistent with how I think I taught. I loved asking questions that would maybe spark some long discussion, that might push some buttons at times, as I try to do with all of you, but especially with Kavanaugh there. But I always walk away from our episodes, as I did as a teacher from classroom experiences. I always walk away with far more questions myself, and being, kind of being that lifelong learner, as I walk away learning something in every episode that we do, because of the skills and insights that you guys
Hey, David,
bring. Yeah,
isn't when he's healthy, isn't Shohei Ohtani a pitcher as well?
that's true, and he is an outlier there, right? He's not the norm. And again, we could also say that, from what I understand, I don't have any empirical data. Most major league pitchers, when they were in high school, were probably the best athlete on the team. They did play another position, they did hit, but the nature of the game gets them to specialize. And we'll see about Latawny's longevity. I'm having a problem with the word today. There. Remember, he's not pitching this year.
I know
So
when he's
and
healthy.
it's the year we could really use him. Ironically, kind of thing. So yeah. So one thing I would like to touch on is, all of us have judged for many years. We've judged at every level: the nationals, the state, our local competitions. Heck, I believe all of us have judged either middle school or elementary hearings in the We the People program. So we've done a lot of hours of assessing and evaluating students. What I'd like you to maybe to provide the teachers and students, given your expertise and your experience, is, other than content. Obviously, we're looking for some mastery of content within the units that the students have been preparing for. But what other, factors, what other elements do you look for in a hearing as part of your assessment there, Mike?
Yeah, I think I'm not talking about the opening statement. I'm talking about the question answer here. Because
Yeah.
opening statements are they're kind of formulaic, although maybe some of you have more to say on that. But the question answer, what I'm looking for is to get away from the robotic sort of answers. I'm hoping to see students kind of think out loud and to think anew and to be listening to what their classmates and what the judges are actually asking and how the narrative is going. So to just be engaged in a thoughtful conversation rather than being like the politician and have your sort of lines that you want to make sure you get out. So that'd be the first thing. I think there's a certain balance between depth and breadth. I talk to my students about the letter T, you know, if the T, if this is the breadth and the T is the depth, right? And you have to have some depth. It has to be more than just the headline of the topic. It has to be more than the Supreme Court holding or the main bullet point of the legislation or the one interpretation of the historical event. I'm looking as a judge for something a little more in depth, and a little more pointing out the contradictions that may go with that. And that's the final one, is that this curriculum, what makes this curriculum so wonderful, I think we all think this, is that there's no right answer. You're making arguments, you're bringing in history and current events and interpretations of the Supreme Court and understanding of institutions. And in a hearing, to be able to acknowledge the contradictions, to call them out, still make your argument, but to listen to them and to at least let the judges and let your teammates know it's not going to be a black or white answer, right? I think that living in that gray area, that nuance is where students should be on this.
Chris?
I'm going to agree with what Mike said. I think the biggest thing one of the biggest things for me is I like for the discussion to be a discussion. I like for it to be organic, right? And Mike used the term canned answers, and we have all seen schools that from nationals all the way down with what are clearly canned answers that have been given to them by their teachers or coaches or unit captains or whatever that may be, whoever that may be working with them. So I really love it when it seems to be a truly organic discussion, and you as a judge, you get a feeling of where the kids are in their abilities. And so when you have those kids that are you feel like they're pretty squared away, you can give them those maybe that Dave Richmond changeup and let them swing at that. I just think that the three things that I always talk to my students about doing, the three words: passion, knowledge, and reasoning. With passion being first, because those are the kids that are the fun kids to engage, right? That will push back, and then they've got a panelist right next to them that's going to jump in and disagree with their colleague or disagree with something we say with the judge, but in a respectful way, right? Gosh, a quick story. Sorry, I remember the last team I took to nationals. So Unit 4, and David Adler, who's a scholar in the network, I mean, he's a friend of the program, brilliant legal scholar, was judging, and in a follow-up, he said, "Well, let's talk about Korematsu for a second." And one of my students, and she just slammed on the table. She goes, "Let's talk about Korematsu," and it was like, whoa! And they were off and running, and it was an organic thing. It wasn't like they had been fed the bullet points, as Mike alluded to, the highlights. They were just dumping into stuff. So I love it when kids have that passion, and that makes it much more effective. Of course, you have to have the knowledge and you have to have the reasoning. Those are other things you have to have. But I mean, for me, I really like those teams that have a little bit of an edge. And one more thing too. I think the opening statements can indicate that. I think, for so often, as a judge, and by the end of the day, you've heard the same answers over and over again. I love it when I hear different takes or kids coming from different angles. I don't want to swear, but we had a Unit 5 question one time about First Amendment stuff, and they brought up some really controversial lines like "F the draft" and "God hates this," and you're using Snyder versus Phelps. They're using Cohen versus California. They're using Chaplinsky. So they're actually using some really, really pushing the envelope kind of stuff, but it was all about the First Amendment and the way the court has come down on some of those things. So I think you can, in your opening statement, it's okay to dare to be different.
Mhm.
I mean, that's push the envelope. That makes it more fun.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I like I'd like to build off Mike's tea analogy. For
Of
me,
course you
'cause
would.
um,
Mr.
it
Continuum.
there you go. Because I think for me, because it does relate to, it's all about me, right? When Mike's talking about depth, for me, I can get a sense of how depth when panelists genuinely, I think what you should be hearing from all of us is avoid gimmicky things. Most judges can see through that, and most judges don't like it, by the way. So hear that, avoid the gimmicky. We've all kind of said that in different ways. But I think for me, I really appreciate, first of all, historical knowledge. But again, I have to be careful with that because the depth in Mike's T chart there, the depth can come out in, we've seen a lot of panels go, oh, I disagree with my colleague. Okay. But another way to do it in a more organic way is to say something like, another way to think about this is, it just comes off as much more, to Chris's point, as a conversation rather than you're trying to get that bullet point, killer, soundbite.
Mm.
So the depth that comes through in what I'll call going backwards and forwards, like if you get a historical question, depth can be shown when you fast forward into presentism.
Mm.
If you get a presentism question, can you go backwards? So I think it's the backwards and forwards piece for me that demonstrates that depth that Mike's talking about, the backwards forwards. And the other thing that may be related to this, there's the Janus, the Roman god of two faces. I've often thought that a good panel, if they're articulating a couple of viewpoints, two faces, two different ways to think about something, two different perspectives. If I'm a judge and I get the sense that this panel has thought about this question, this topic, from multiple angles, I think that demonstrates depth as well, at least for me.
The only thing I would have to add there is, having seen this, so many of these, is what I would call authenticity. There is no doubt that a classroom of students who have a good instructor and those students have worked hard, that at the end of the process, those students know more and can talk about more in depth than 99% of American society. And as I told students over the years, they probably will never have an experience like this in college or at any other time, to be part of a group that's focused on an intellectual endeavor that we call a competition, but it's also about the soul of the nation, kind of thing. And so, but sometimes, students practice so much, they become programmed. And they don't come off as a high school class, they come off as something other. And then I begin to wonder how much they've really thought about this. That is, they hear a word and a question and they go off on a pathway, and I don't know if they're really responsive. So I'm looking for a sense of authenticity, conversational style, some real, sense of that they have thought about this, but they're using their own experiences, as well as the historic and the philosophical, to come up with their approaches to that. Chris, you had one other thing to say.
Something Tim said made me think of, the other thing I really like is when students are not bound by the question. So you're given a follow-up question. A lot of times judges will, they give you that either or kind of question, right? And don't, for the students, they're jumping into this, you're going to be really nervous and you're going to hear that question. You're going to try and go, well, this side, or then maybe you have a colleague will take the other side. Hopefully you'll have a student on the panel will say, I don't really necessarily agree with the, parameter of your question, because and that shows that authenticity. And to couple with something David just said that makes me think of it, yeah, for the students, you're just beginning this program. You're going to go on this journey. By the time you get done, you're going to know so much stuff. Don't think that these old guys sitting across from you and that one not so old guy, Professor Williams, and these other judges, they know, we know some stuff, but you guys know a lot of stuff too. So it's okay to push back on some of this stuff. And that's like, no, don't be bound by the parameters of some of the questions you may get. So I think that helps with that authenticity that you're talking about, David.
So the last topic I'd like to share with our students and teachers before this season begins is, given that this is an election year, and as I said in the opening, we are in the middle of what many might describe as turbulent times. I'd like each of you to share maybe your specific insights, views on the Constitution that you would like students and teachers to consider as they study and prepare for the hearings. And I'm going to start this one off. And I read an article essay a month ago or something that I think really reflects some of the struggles that we are experiencing. And it really is about, this term soul of the nation. Who are we? And that is, are we a creedal nation? And I hear politicians, I've heard them say, we are an idea. America is different, exceptional, and unique because our national identity is about ideas. And I've begun to wonder in the last 10 years of my life if that's true, or are we similar to all other nations in the world in the sense that we have this nationalistic identity. It's not about ideas. It's about language. It's about blood. It's about a specific, identity similar to European nations and things like that. So as you go through your studies, consider that, as you hear people say, oh, well, America is built upon a foundation of ideas. Is that really true? All right. Is that something you accept? Or are we, I guess, a hybrid kind of nation there? Is that we have some components of traditional nation state nationalism, but we also do have this I guess, exceptional notion of we have these ideas framed in the 18th century that we keep trying to perfect, if we want to use the language of the Constitution. So, Mike, anything about the Constitution, your view of it, theories of it, that you would ask students and teachers to consider as they go through this process?
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to highlight, all these questions have been really good, Dave, but this one's really thought-provoking. So this is a good model of what we've been talking about and what we try to emulate in these things. So thank you for coming up with this question. So I kind of approached it just thinking about what I wish someone would have told me when I was 18. Mr. Richmond was telling me things. So, going through this process in an election year that seems like it's the most important election in our history, right? And so I came across this quote. It's attributed to Marie Antoinette, but I'm not really sure. There's nothing new except what has been forgotten. So I would encourage students, as they're, thinking about current events the next few months, to think about the enduring questions and the enduring issues of the United States, and to see what connections there are there. Is there something new going on? Is this election any more dramatic than 1800? Is it any more dramatic than 1860? Like, to use the history you're learning to really think through the constitutional issues through a historical kind of lens. I also think that I would encourage students and teachers to not just focus on what's happening at the national level, to think through what's happening at your state and local level. What things are being talked about there? How are they being talked about? The content that you're going to be learning through this curriculum, how do you see that showing up in a mayor's race or in a city council race? To not just get fixated on the national elections, as important as they are, but to kind of translate that to the local. And then finally, it's Sherlock Holmes, right? It's the non-barking dog kind of idea. Like, what is not being talked about at the national level, state level, or local level? What issues are in your school, in your community that are really, really important to you that no one seems to be addressing? Why is that? Be curious about that. Think through the issues that are not on the table, the voices that are not being heard, as well as everything that you're going to be getting from the news about what is out there. So I guess those were 3 bullet points of things I think students and teachers should be thinking about.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I was thinking, I think there's a Harry Truman quote that's like, there's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know, which is, for a plain spoken guy from Missouri that Harry Truman was. I agree with what Mike said, really good stuff. Not only that, but maybe some of your local school board races, they could be entertaining. But I would ask, here's from 30,000 feet, is the Constitution as it stands able to deal with the strain of a contentious election? And Mike mentioned too, 1800, Jefferson and Adams, 1860, Lincoln's election, which of course leads to the Civil War. Is the Constitution, as we see it today, as we interpret it today, is it in a position to hold together against the strains of what could prove to be a very contentious election? And if so, great. Why? And if not, why not? So I think for you guys going through the program, think of it that way, because I mentioned Dr. Adler earlier a second ago, and he always talks about like 4 corners. Is it within the 4 corners of the Constitution for these powers that governments have, and institutions have? Are the powers there in the document for us to be able to move forward after a very contentious election? So think about it that way.
And Professor Moore.
Yeah, I think we've always struggled with the issue of the one and the many. Even from our founding period, there were some folks that made the argument we're one nation, and they were, therefore this Constitution can be that glue. And then there were others that weren't quite convinced that the Constitution would do that. And before the revolution, are we one? Are we the many? So I think it's a recurring theme in our history. And honestly, I'm kind of ambivalent to a lot of our crises throughout our history, and that's a kind of a soft spot, a critique of my way of thinking. But rest assured, we've always had the problem of the one and the many. Another thing to consider is, I think, is how to Chris's point, I mean, do we have a Constitution that can bend and flex? Can it survive, the weather, the storms? And I think I think I know everybody in this circle well enough to know that we're varying shades of an evolving Constitution, which is kind of odd for a person like me, because I'm steeped in what the founders and framers were thinking. But I think you need to kind of get comfortable with this notion that the Constitution is flexible. Now, I think there's an honest argument to be made about how flexible, how committed to the past we are. And I think there's some disagreements here in the circle on that too. But the Constitution is experiment. I mean, the preamble basically says this is an experiment. And my argument is the preamble kind of sets us up for a living Constitution in a way. So I think that's a fundamental principle. I think that you need to probably wrestle with that. But Chris's point's well taken, that is this thing flexible enough to survive the storm? And we may be in one right now. We'll see as the fall unfolds. But that would be my thoughts on it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, students and teachers, as we come to the end of this.
Dave,
episode.
were you going to one of the great strengths of the FOPs is the resources? Were you going to mention that?
Yeah, that's where I was heading. Right.
Okay. You're right.
That's
why you're the bus driver.
They call me the bus driver, but you always have a backseat driver on the bus there, and there's your perfect example. of that. So I wanted to remind you and let those of you who are new to the program, because just today I became aware that a teacher in my own community was not aware of these videos, which I was somewhat surprised to hear there. So if you're new to the program, and for those of you who have watched some episodes from last season or a previous season, just a reminder that when you get into the YouTube program, that we do have a timestamp. If you go there, I think there's a button that says more. You click that on. We have a timestamp, so you or students don't necessarily need to see the entire episode, although we recommend it. But if you wanted to, and on that timestamp, it has the questions, the topics that we have discussed through that hour or so. And if you only want to see 5 minutes of a certain discussion, you can do that. And also below that, we have a sources section for every episode that we try to provide you links to primary sources, secondary sources, video sources, whatever that we think might help you in instruction and your learning process in this program. And lastly, we highly encourage you to share the program with others if you think it would help them in their instruction. Even if they're not a competitive We the People teacher, we believe that some of the topics we talk about would help anybody in a government class. In fact, we think it would inspire discussion amongst church groups as well as any civic organization and things like that. So I'm hoping that this first segment, the intro segment, helps you. Our plan is to cover all 18 questions for the state program, for the state competition, and all 18 questions for the nationals this year. So that's 36 in total here over the next academic year, and we look forward to seeing you most every week. So until our next episode, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.